are at war with Japan.
That Australia will make him inch by inch, and that he shall not enter upon our country.
Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds.
Hello and welcome to the next episode of Virtual Battlefield Flyovers. This is Michael Madden. We are sitting over a very famous piece of land here in X-Plane 11. We're looking down on the Middle East. We have the Gaza Strip up here to the right, Dead Sea's this way, and we are over an airport at a place called Arish. Now, I threatened in the last episode to recreate the flight of Frank McNamara VC, a Victoria Cross recipient, and I've decided to go ahead and do that as much as I can. Now, this obviously is not the exact base where the Australians were flying out of and working out of in the Middle East in World War One, but it is Arish. It was very close to this area. This is the international airport, and the landscape here is kind of sparse in this simulator, which is kind of probably a little bit reflective of what it may have been like 100 years ago. Now, Frank McNamara was our only pilot to receive the Victoria Cross in World War One. I spoke a little bit about the VC in the last episode. I'll talk a little bit more about that. Frank's VC action is one of the most extraordinary stories you'll ever hear. And we're doing this flight in late afternoon. I'll talk a little bit about what Frank did and a few other things of interest as we go along. We're sitting in the middle of a huge runway in our Cessna 172 Skyhawk. Obviously, this is not the aircraft Frank was flying in on the day. He was flying a Marshal, a British aircraft, a double wing biplane, as he used to call them back in the day, and he was out doing a bombing raid when his action took place. So we're just going to head on out here, get on with the flight, and I'll tell you a little bit about Frank and what happened. Most people don't sort of associate this part of the world with Australian service during World War One. Obviously, there's a lot about Gallipoli and Beersheba and obviously the Western Front. But we had pilots here working with the British, including Frank. They acquitted themselves very well. Frank was the only man to receive the Victoria Cross in the only Australian pilot to receive it in World War One. Now, I spoke a bit about that, and I'll just touch a bit more of it on what the VC is. The Victoria Cross, if you don't know, and sorry if you heard this in the last episode, I'll repeat myself a little bit here. The Victoria Cross is the world's, or at least the British and Commonwealth's, highest award for valour. It is the highest award that can be bestowed on a member of the military forces, British military forces. It's for actions in the face of the enemy. So where the enemy is present and you display unbelievable courage and valour. There's only been 100 Australians who have received the award. And of course I wrote the book, The Victoria Cross Australia Remembers, which covers the 100 Australians who received the award. Now, I'm not going to go too high today, probably settle in at about 2,000 feet, thereabouts, probably not even that. They wouldn't have been flying overly high back in those days, and nowhere near this speed obviously, though they did go alright. Obviously aircraft these days are very different. So Frank's job on the day, flying with the Australians and with a few of his mates, was to fly out to a railway line out near the Gaza Strip and to bomb it and then come home. Very dangerous mission. There was, I believe, a shortage of bombs at the time, and as a result they had customised, I suppose, some howitzer type ordnance, and they'd carry 6 of them out in the cockpit with them. They would literally grab the bomb, arm it, lean out of the cockpit and drop it. And literally just let go of it and let it fall to the ground and explode. And Frank was doing that. We're going to head sort of a bit more to the south here now. Well, I might go out over Gaza, because you could remember that back in those days they didn't have any of the sophisticated navigation equipment that we have today. They literally, everything was VFR, which means visual flight rules, so there was nothing else. They had to do everything by line of sight, navigation, using compasses and maps. So I'm assuming flying on his own without a navigator, that his Martenside was a single seater, that he would have been using visual references to find the railway. Now he either flew directly south-east from his position of base, which he may have done until he saw the railway line, or he probably flew out over the Gaza Strip, which would have been easy to find, and obviously the sea to the left would have been an easy way to navigate. It was a daytime raid, obviously, and very, very dangerous. So we're going to fly out a little bit over the Gaza Strip and then down into the area where he bombed. We might even do a bit of a mock bomb run. Not that dangerous in a Cessna, but anyway. Okay, so we're flying along the coast of the Mediterranean Sea. Gaza Strip is this direction. We're now heading out towards the railway line that the Australians bombed. May get sight of the Gaza Strip as we go through. Now, these raids were obviously very dangerous. This is a famous part of the world for Australia in World War I. Okay, so that is the Gaza Strip in the distance. So the airport there. And we are flying now pretty much directly towards the railway line that the Australians bombed on that day. The famous town of Beersheba is its way to the south. The famous charge of the Light Brigade, the Light Horse, beg your pardon, the charge of the Light Horse. It's hard to believe that the men actually had the courage to do this, literally to fly out and navigate off their own bats and just to literally drop bombs from the cockpits to try and hit the railway lines. When we get closer towards the target, I'll tell you a little bit about what happened. It was a fairly small flight. I think there was 4 aircraft, Martensides and the B2s. There may have been more, but there are only 4 I can remember. Mention. I'm going off memory here. I probably should have had more notes with me, but I do know the story kind of well. Now, Frank's medals are now on display in the Shrine of Remembrance in Melbourne. His original medals, everything except the Victoria Cross, which is on display at the RAF Museum in London. The museum gave the family a replica VC to put on his set, because Frank left instructions that the VC itself should never leave England and return to Australia. He had a bit of a falling out with the Australian Air Force after World War II. He wasn't particularly happy with his treatment. You can see the Gaza Strip off here. I think that's the Dead Sea this way. So they put a replica on it and gave it back to the family with all his medals. I know Frank's grandson quite well, Mike. He's a lovely, lovely guy, and the family gave those medals or loaned those medals to the shrine in Melbourne. You can go and see them. They are on display. There's a great little display there for Frank. You can see all his medals and I think his compass and his flying hat and a few other bits and pieces out there. Okay, we have the railway line in sight, and look at that. There's a big old freight train going along it. He's about to have a bad day if this was the real deal. So this, as far as I can tell on the simulator, would have been part of the line that the Australians bombed. As I said, they literally just flew out here and dropped the bombs out of the cockpit, deep into enemy territory against the Turks, and that is how they did it. We're going to fly down a little bit and have a bit of a look. So Frank had 6 bombs on board, as I said earlier. Now, he had dropped, I believe, 3 with great effect. See how the Australians were continuing to do the same thing. When he went to drop the 4th bomb, it exploded prematurely, quite close to the fuselage, and a piece of shrapnel went through his leg, gashing his leg shockingly. When it detonated, he was really, really badly wounded. He survived, although he was in an awful amount of pain, and he clearly was bleeding to death and dying, so he had to return to base. So he turned around and he flew back, and Mike, Frank's grandson, tells me that Frank used to talk about how the loss of blood and the pain was so bad that he would have to, he used to talk about putting his head out the side of the cockpit into the cold air to stop himself from passing out from pain and loss of blood. And there's a bridge here. Of course, I don't know which part of this railway line he dropped his bombs, but let's just say it was the bridge. Of course, the fuselage of a World War I biplane was not the most robust thing, as obviously the shrapnel cut through it like paper and ripped into his leg. So here we are. Obviously I don't have any bombs to drop, although I believe you can do that in this simulator. You can actually, there is military aircraft and you could actually do it. So I could put a modern aircraft, there's 2 trains here, I could actually put a modern aircraft into the simulator and actually drop a bomb here. I'm not going to do that, we don't need to. This shows you we've gone right out to where Frank would have been dropping his ordnance, around this area, and as I said, the 4th one detonated prematurely, and at this stage he is now fighting for his life. He has a badly damaged aircraft. His leg is badly injured, so he turns around and he flies back home. Again, he has to navigate by himself. It is a single-seater aircraft, the Martin side that he's in. So he's on his own, he has to find his way back. Now obviously Frank has one thing in mind now, and that is survival. He's obviously cannot complete the mission. I don't know that perhaps he threw the rest of his bombs out, I'm not 100% sure from memory. I assume he would have still had 2 left. I'd say he probably did just drop them and go home. Now this is where things started to get very, very interesting, if they already weren't. At some stage here, when Frank was flying back to Arish, back to the Australian base, he looked out the cockpit window and he saw a downed aircraft, an Australian aircraft. One of his mates, by the name of Rutherford, I think his name was down in a paddock here. He wasn't sure what had happened, whether he'd been shot or if the aircraft was damaged, destroyed. So now you've got to stop and think here. He could see as he got closer, knew who it was, that it was his mate, and you could see his mate outside the aircraft, perhaps trying to get it going. Obviously there was something wrong with the aircraft that had broken down, and so Frank is dying at this stage. There's not much he can do. He's in a single-seater aircraft, so he can't he can't pick his mate up. And what he sees as he flies over this tree line is an entire battalion of Turkish cavalry on horseback closing in on his mate. They've got him surrounded and they're closing in. So he knows that his mate's about to die, he's about to be killed, and there's been stories of downed pilots being hacked to death by the Turks, and he knew that that was his mate's fate. Now, there is literally nothing Frank can do at this stage. He is dying. He is well within his rights to obviously report what he's seen. Let's say he's in this paddock here. He cannot help this man. There is nothing he can do. He's dying himself. His aircraft is damaged. He can't fit him on board. So he organises the rest of his flight to come and assist where they can. And he goes to his mate's rescue anyway, even though he's well within his rights just to continue on and report that the other Australian had been down, but he cannot bring himself to leave him here. So, unbelievably, for reasons only he will ever know, as the cavalry closed in on his mate, he turned his aircraft. He's at this stage a dying man. And he lands beside his mate. As I said, he just simply cannot bring himself to watch his friend die. It's impossible to know what, if any, plan he had, other than he was not going to leave him. So he touched down. The Australians organised themselves ahead, the Australians that were still airborne and able to fly over the attacking cavalry and to strafe them with machine gun fire to try and buy his mate some time. Now obviously, being a single-seater, there's not much he can do. So he tells his mate, as the cavalry close in, you can imagine hundreds of horses charging, he tells his mate, you know what, I'm not going to leave you here. Why don't you climb on the wing? It's only a one-seater aircraft. Jump on the wing. We'll see if we can fly out of here. So his mate jumps on the wing, and under heavy fire, they go to take off in the Martin side with his mate literally hanging on to the struts of the wing. And of course, they cannot get the aircraft off the ground. It crashes. In the VC citation, it uses the terrible English of it crashes badly. Obviously, I don't know what crash isn't badly. They all are. But the aircraft was totaled. They weren't injured. Nonetheless, that they were now trapped on the ground. Frank was badly wounded. The aircraft was destroyed. They had pistols and pistols only. They had an entire battalion of cavalry closing in around them. So they set fire to the Martin side so it couldn't be captured, and they retreated back to Frank's mate's aircraft because it is literally the only option they had left. So almost certainly still within sight of the target. I can still see a train moving over here. They return to the B-2, which is a bigger plane. It has 2 seats at least, and it was not damaged, it just was broken down. They only have pistols, so Frank's mate has to sort of help him out, and you can imagine how they were feeling after that crash. And obviously now they're just expecting to die. There's nothing to lose now, so firing their pistols, they run back to the second aircraft. Frank climbs into the cockpit and his mate tries to start it. And look what we have here. This is a very similar aircraft to B-2. Not exactly the same, but it gives you the idea. I thought it'd be a bit of fun to jump in this and try and fly it back. So Rutherford goes to work on the engine, trying to turn it over and get it going. Frank sits in the pilot seat, which is actually the rear cockpit here, the seat in the cockpit here, the front, that's the observer seat. Gets his pistol out. Remember, the cavalry are still closing in through the trees here. The Australians are flying overhead, strafing them, trying to keep them off, and they just wait to die. They just keep turning it over and not expecting it to start, but there's nothing else to do. At this stage you've got to wonder what Frank was thinking. He's put himself in this situation purely out of selflessness. He must have known that this was going to happen, that there was no way he could really effectively do anything, but he seemed quite reserved to that, and he did it anyway, which is what the Victoria Cross is all about. It has to be selfless. So you can imagine we are inside, a little bit different to the Cessna. This is your navigation equipment. The B-2 would have been very similar. He's sitting here firing his pistol at the cavalry, waiting to die, and all of a sudden the engine starts. And Rutherford climbs in, and they take off for all they're worth. You can imagine getting this thing off the ground. I don't even know if this is going to be possible in the simulator. Bumpy ground. This whole time they're under fire from the enemy. Frank is getting close to death now. He's bleeding out. He's in awful pain. At this stage they were still about 113 kilometres from the base. Frank had to try and maintain consciousness in order to get home. Now this tells a lot about the Victoria Cross and what it's all about. It's essentially, the award is for extreme acts of valour, selflessness. Your actions have to have won the day, at least back in those days, and made a difference to the outcome of the battle. And it had to be witnessed, and of course this action was witnessed not just by Rutherford, who he saved, but by the other two Australian pilots who were circling overhead. I think their names were Drummond and no, I can't remember. But anyway, they witnessed it, and even under best of conditions here, I'm finding this thing difficult to fly. He would have had to have just used his compass. So that's north there with the crosshair on it. So if we fly north-west, we're going to find Gaza in the Mediterranean Sea. About as high as we need to be. This is where, as Mike said, I think that's Gaza dead ahead. So again on the fly purely by sight here. There's no autopilot, obviously, it's hand-on controls all the way. That's Frank going to have to do. This is where, as Mike said, he had to put his head out the cockpit window. You can see the forward position where Rutherford would have been sitting. It's one thing you find in common with all Victoria Cross recipients is they have very little in common. They come from all walks of life. One thing you do find in common is a degree of humility. So I think that's a fairly important fact. Clearly Frank had those traits as well. Again, as I said earlier, he would have been well within his rights to leave Rutherford there. Nobody would have begrudged him that. He would not have got in trouble. There was should have been no way on earth he could have helped him. Nothing he could have done. But he obviously knew that he could live with himself, or he just felt it was his duty. Whatever he was thinking, he wasn't thinking about getting a Victoria Cross or anything else of that nature. He had one thought in his mind, and that is to save his mate. It's as simple as that, and that's what it always comes down to. It's always about one mate saving another. Pure and simple. So we're flying above Gaza now. I'm using the coastline to help me get back. This is the Gaza Strip, very, very famous piece of land. For some reason there's no people sitting in the cockpit, which looks a little strange, but as I say, this is a simulator. There is supposed to be 2 people in there. I've done something wrong loading the aircraft, but it doesn't matter. We get the picture. And now we use in line of sight. We're going to try and find the airport and come in. It's the endurance of the man to endure what he did, to stay conscious and to be able to fly one of these things. Been through what he'd just been through and literally bleeding to death while he was doing it. It's a very remarkable feat. So Frank got them home. It was an incredible feat. The human endurance and self-sacrifice was just amazing. And the fact that he managed to make it back literally dying is incredible, but he did. He landed safely, which I may not do because this is very difficult to fly. And when he landed, everybody rushed over to the aircraft. The other Australians of his flight had seen what he'd done. And I'm quoting here, they say that when they approached the aircraft, all they got from him was a line of expletives. He was in all sorts of pain, as you can imagine. So this is really, really difficult to fly. Anyway, they got him out of the cockpit, and they tried to get him out of the cockpit. It wasn't long after he had landed that he blacked out. So finally succumbed to his injuries. And, it's a miracle he landed in one piece. They rushed him off to the hospital. He was operated on by a young Australian doctor who patched him up and was satisfied that he'd saved his life. This young hero pilot that everyone was talking about. And he left and went for lunch, the doctor, and he came back later to check on Frank, only to find that he was gone. Because he asked the nurses and other doctors where was he, and they said that he had died. The while you were out to lunch, succumbed to his injuries and died. The doctor refused to accept that. He was confident that he had done enough to save him and that he should be fine. They asked him where he was. They said that they'd put him in the morgue. Boy, this is hard to land. So the doctor went off to the morgue. And found him and put a mirror under his nose. Apparently he'd been bagged and tagged a whole lot. Doctor put a mirror to his nose and the mirror steamed up. Showed that he was still alive. So this very smart doctor realised what had happened. He'd given him an injection or a tetanus shot, and it turned out Frank was allergic to tetanus and had gone into a coma. So he asked for immediate action and stim packs, and they went to work on him and they brought him back. And they say that afternoon he was sitting up in bed eating chicken and drinking champagne. It's just an incredible story. Honestly, if you had heard that, read that story or seen it in a movie, you just wouldn't believe it. The whole thing from start to finish, that he, his mate Rutherford climbing on the wing, and but it is true. It is how it happened. I hope that was interesting. It's one of my favourite VC stories. That thing was difficult to fly. I'm going to do Gallipoli next. But obviously this isn't an exact representation of the flight, but it gives you an idea of what Frank did. And if you want to know more about the Victoria Cross itself, the award, please feel free to buy the book, Victoria Cross Australia Remembers. All profits from that book go to TPI Victoria. It is for totally and permanently incapacitated veterans.